ask questions. All right. And can everyone see my screen then?
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. So for anyone who doesn't know me, my name's Carmen. I am new to being a leader at the Dayton Dairylanders. This is my first year. I grew up in Milton, Wisconsin way back in the day, and I belong to the Johnstown 4-H Club there. So we were part of the Rock County Fairgrounds. I was in clothing for 7 years. In 4-H, I also took foods, rabbits, sheep, and then sewing was probably like my favorite thing to do. My mom was my sewing leader, and I got to help run a lot of our meetings. They were out of our house, and all the neighbors would come to our house and sew, and it was some of my favorite summer memories. I also have a degree in fashion marketing. So a lot of my college classes were around fabrics. I had one class where we were given this giant bag of little pieces of fabric, and we would have to be able to pull them apart and tell our professor if they were a weave or a knit, if they were dyed, if they were printed, and then identify types of fabric. That was probably the hardest class I've ever done. But it was great. We also learned all of the clothing construction, different terms for different types of sleeves and different types of pants. And then we focused a lot on the marketing aspect of it. So if we were either making clothing or we were trying to sell clothing to other people, like how did we understand what those people were looking for? Like what would they want in an outfit or a clothing piece, and how are we going to communicate to that to them? So I'm very passionate about clothing, if you can't tell. And then I've included 2 pictures here. So these are 2 of my favorite sewing projects that I had done. So the first one closest to the words, I had sewn the vest and the shorts that I'm wearing, and then I also had sewn the white blouse and this handkerchief skirt that my friend Ria was wearing. And then my first year in sewing was a little watermelon dress that I had sewn for my cousin Jenny, who was I think 3 or 4 at the time. So those were 2 of my favorite projects that I just wanted to share with you guys. So the first thing I want to talk about is reading the back of the pattern. I think that's probably the most challenging thing when we first start sewing, because there's so much important information on there, and you can just look at that and be like, I don't even know where to start. So I kind of want to break it down by sections for you, so you kind of know what to look at for a pattern and what's important. So to kind of break it down, when you're looking at your pattern envelope, at the top is usually your fabric suggestions. And these are important because if you don't pick the right type of fabric, the construction can be really hard to do, or your project may not turn out very well just because the fabric isn't the right fit for that project. Another important thing is making sure that you take your measurements every time before you sew a project. Different patterns can have different sizes, and you want to make sure that you're cutting out the right size for your project. And then once you know your size and your fabric, you have to know how much fabric do you need. So in the middle section, they'll tell you if you have this, if you're making dress A, you need this much fabric to be a size 6. They usually include the little drawings too of the different types of outfits or items that are included in your pattern. And then at the bottom is usually the finished size. So if you're sewing this pattern, this is how long the back is going to be. So all of this information is crammed in a really little section, but a lot of important information in there. So one of the things I wanted to really point out was reading your pattern size. So one thing I want to reiterate is ready to wear that you buy in the store is usually not the same size on a pattern size. So you may normally wear like a size medium or a size 8 or 10 in regular clothes from Target. But when you go to measure yourself, you may measure at like a 14 and you're like, no, like this isn't right. So always go by your measurements on the pattern. I argued with my mom once and I cut out the size of what I wore from a store, and let's just say that dress did not fit when it was sewn. So the important thing to remember is the size isn't inside your dress. Nobody knows what size you cut. You just cut the size you measure for, and you will be much, much happier. An important thing to know is how to take your measurements. So a couple of the measurements that they usually ask for is going to be either your bust or your chest, so around your top, your waist, your hips, and then usually some sorts of, depending whether you're doing like a shirt or a pants, you're gonna need to do from like the back of your neck to your waist or your waist to your hem. One thing to remember when you're taking measurements, if you're sewing something for yourself, it's usually helpful if somebody else can take your measurements. When you're trying to like bend the tape measure around you, it just is never quite right. And another tip I have is to don't pull the tape measure too tight. Make sure you have a little wiggle room that you can slide it around, because you may pull it a little too tight, and that's going to just affect the size of your garment and what size pattern you do. So always give yourself a little bit of wiggle room. And remember, you can always make the garment smaller. You can't make it bigger. So give yourself that room. And if you find maybe, let's say you're measuring yourself and you're doing like a dress, you measure a size 6 in the chest, but a size 8 in the waist, you're probably going to want to cut the big size. You may look at the finished measurements and be like, oh, this is a really baggy waist. I might be okay. But I always like to err on the side of caution. If I'm measuring between two sizes and two different measurements, I always try to cut for the bigger size. Does that make sense? Okay. So the next part is looking at how much fabric do you need. So that's the middle section of the back of your pattern. And you can see at the top, they have the different sizes. So they have 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. And then they tell you if you're doing top A, you're going to have, 2 yards of fabric for a size 10. One thing that the back of this pattern doesn't show is when you're at the fabric store, a lot of times your fabric can either come in 45-inch widths or 60-inch widths. So always make sure you check that when you're getting your fabric cut. And some patterns will tell you for the different widths, they'll have both of them listed on here. All right, so one important thing is choosing your fabric. So you can see I put a picture up here of a woven fabric and a knit fabric. Do you guys know, other than the fact of how they're put together, the woven is woven together and the knit is loops. Do you know why that makes a difference in your clothing projects? Or the difference in the main difference in those two fabrics is? So a woven fabric is much sturdier, and when you pull on it, it doesn't stretch, but a knit is going to stretch a lot. So this can be really important in the type of projects that you're sewing. If, let's say, you're sewing this actually happened to me once. I was sewing my Christmas dress. I think I was like 14 or 15. And I picked out this really pretty, like velvety looking fabric. Well, it turned out it was a knit, and my dress had all of these different seams in it, and my fabric kept stretching as I was sewing, and it was the hardest thing I've probably ever sewn. But when I looked at the back of my pattern specifically said not suitable for knits, but I didn't care because I had picked velvet fabric. So that was a tough lesson to learn. So when you're looking at your fabric, it's important to know just how much is it going to stretch, because that can really affect the fit and wear of your garment. So you can see up here when we're talking about selecting fabric types, they can get really specific. So this pattern is telling you need like silks and charmeuse and jacquards and gauze and crinkle gauze. And these may be names that you've never heard of before. So don't be afraid to, I still use Google for fabrics when I don't know, or I have really good luck with the people at Joann's. They're very passionate about sewing as well. So I may ask them to help like direct me in the right section of what kind of fabric I should be looking for. But it's always important to kind of stick with what they recommend. Now, when you're also picking out fabric, I know when I was growing up, the first thing I looked at was like color and prints. Like, I love the color of this fabric. I love the print of this fabric. There's 3 other things I would love you to think about when you're picking out fabric, and that's going to be the weight of the fabric, the drape of the fabric, and the hand of the fabric. So the first thing is the weight of the fabric, and the best way I can do to explain that is to think of the like a cotton button-down shirt, like how light that fabric is versus like a denim. A denim is a heavy fabric. So you wouldn't use the same type of fabric for both of those projects because they have different wears and they work for different projects. A drape is a little bit harder to explain, so I use these pictures to try to show you. A drape is like how the fabric falls. Some fabrics are stiffer, and if you draped them, they would just kind of stick out. And some fabrics have a softer drape, so when you do it, they like run straight down. So the pattern fabric in my picture, that one has a softer drape. It comes straight down. But the one with the green one, that has a lower drape, so it kind of sticks out and is a little more stiff. And I find like this is more, take this into consideration a lot when I'm making dresses, especially when you think of like, how is the skirt gonna fall? Do you want it to be like a low flowy skirt, or do you want it to be like a structured skirt that doesn't drape and flow? So that's something to think about when you're picking up fabric. And then another thing is the hand. So the hand is literally like, how does it feel in your hand? Is it a soft hand, like, you know, a nice like cotton t-shirt, or is it stiff and scratchy like a wool sweater? So when you think about your fabric, really think about, you know, what are you going to use it for? How do you want to feel in it? Like, what do you want it to look like? And that will help you determine if you want, you know, what type of weight you want in your fabric, the drape, and the hand of it. Does anybody have any questions about the weight, the drape, or the hand? It's so hard to explain when I can't like give you fabrics to feel and like compare side by side. So that one was a little bit harder to find some good pictures for that. Another thing to think about when you are picking out fabrics is to think about the proportion of your print. Parker and I just had this happen this past Easter. She found this super cool fabric. I thought it was super cool. We were gonna make a sundress out of it. It had like toucans and flamingos on it. We went to cut out the pieces, and our pieces are so small you couldn't fit a single bird on it. So she has like half of a flamingo's head, and she's got like a toucan's wing, and like when we sew the dress together, you don't see a single bird. Like our print was much too big for the pattern that we had. We needed to do a much simpler dress if we wanted to have a print that big. So when you're the position of prints, you can see I have a large polka dot, a medium polka dot, and a small polka dot. Things that I think about are the size of the person. When you're sewing for a 3-year-old versus maybe your mom, you might want a different size polka dot. If you pick a very large polka dot, you might not end up with full polka dots on this little girl's dress. But when you're smaller like I am, lots of little polka dots make my dress look really busy, so I may want a bigger polka dot. So thinking about the pieces, if there's a lot of pieces you're going to cut out of your garment and be constructed, it breaks up your print a lot. So think about that when you're picking out a print. Is this a good size print for my garment? Does anybody have any questions about proportion? All right. Another thing to think about is, because who doesn't love to sew in a cute plaid skirt or sweater, or I love a good stripe. It's really important that you look at your pattern. Some of them will tell you that like not suitable for a plaid, or if you have a plaid or a stripe, to buy some extra fabric. Because you'll see in these two pictures, the fabric was laid out and they didn't take the time to line up the stripes or the plaids, so it looks a little funny. And I think that's something when you're being judged for the 4-H fair, if your stripes don't line up, like I think that's something that a judge would probably call out. So taking that extra time and a little bit of extra fabric to make sure you can line that up will really help with your projects. And then something else, I have all of these stories of things that I've done wrong. So I remember I was in high school and I got this super great fabric that had all of these goldfish on it. But when I cut out my pattern, I didn't realize that all of my goldfish swam the same way. And I cut my fabric upside down. So all of my goldfish were upside down on my shorts. So it looked like I had like dead fish on there because they were all like floating upside down. So when you're looking at a print, I want you to also pay attention. Is it a directional print or a non-directional print? So you can see the ballerinas in the corner, they all go one way. So you're going to want to make sure that when you're laying out your pattern, you lay them right side up so that your ballerinas aren't all upside down in your shirt or shorts, whatever you're making. But you can see the tacos are great because they all go different ways. So this one, it's not as critical to like make sure that you're laying your pattern a certain way, and no matter what way you do it, there's no up and down to your pattern. Does that make sense? And another thing to think about when you're picking out your fabric is to think about your fabric care instructions. This is usually on the bolt of the fabric at the end in really small print, and they may use some of these symbols instead of words. But one thing to think about is, I don't know about you, but I don't really like to do laundry. So I try very hard not to buy fabric that says hand wash. I don't want to wash it by hand. I want to throw it in the washing machine, throw it in the dryer, and be done. Also thinking about like ironing, you know, is it something you're going to want to iron? And maybe for, you know, a fancy dress or a nice shirt, you don't mind ironing, but if you're going to be like, well, I'm going to use this t-shirt to go play soccer in, you don't want it to be a fabric that requires like ironing or hand washing, because it's going to be something you want to throw in the washer. Something to watch for too is dry cleaning. I don't know about you, but my mom always hated dry cleaning because she said it was so expensive. So she always had us double check our fabrics to make sure they weren't dry clean only. But I think my recent fabric shopping, everything's been in words. I haven't had to deal with these symbols too much. I find these more on some ready-to-wear products, but it's always just good to be familiar with them. All right. So, and the fabric care is also important too, because there's some steps you should do for your fabric before you cut it out. So pre-washing is really important in your fabrics. There can be shrinkage, and you can get some times where you get a piece of fabric and you wash it and it can shrink an inch or two. Like, it can be significant. So if you were to buy your fabric, cut it out, sew it, and then wash it, it could actually shrink to a size that's too small for you. But if you washed it first, you would know that it's already shrunk, and then you could cut out your fabric. Another thing for pre-washing that's really great to try to eliminate is bleeding. So I really like to make sure that if I am going to be doing a project that has multiple pieces of fabric, all of them need to be pre-washed, so that like if I were to do something with like a red and white patchwork or something, that you wouldn't get the same bleed through that you see on this quilt here. So you can see where the red is kind of like bled into the pink or into the white and kind of made it pink. Another thing to think about with pre-washing is your fabric going to fray? So depending on, especially a knit doesn't usually fray, but a woven fabric similar to this weave, like a twill will fray a lot. You may want to zigzag your edges before you wash it, just to make sure your fabric doesn't fray a lot in the wash. That's kind of a handy tip to do. And you can tell how much it's going to fray by actually just pulling at the edges of your fabric. If you like kind of pull like this and nothing really comes out, you're probably good to pre-wash it without finishing your edges. If you do that and you get like this fabric where there's all kinds of threads coming out, I probably would put a quick zigzag stitch around that piece of fabric just to make sure that it holds up when I'm washing it. So another thing to look at on your patterns is going to be notions. Notions are pretty much just a fancy word for everything you need besides fabric. It's going to include zippers and interfacing and thread, and if you need snaps or buttons. It'll tell you if you need elastic, what size elastic. It's pretty much like a recipe card of everything you need for your pattern. And then when you're starting to get ready to cut out, the pattern will tell you how to lay out your fabric, and they'll kind of give you a great way to do it. You don't have to do it that way, but the way they have it set up is usually the best way to use the least amount of fabric. If you opt not to do that way, be very careful that you get all your pieces laid out, because you don't want to like run out of fabric. And you'll notice when you're laying out your fabric and cutting your pattern, there'll be some things that they'll talk about for setting up. So they're going to talk about your selvage. So your selvage is the finished edge of your fabric. It's the part that is like woven nicely on the machine. And then you usually have your cut edge of your fabric too. So the selvage is the nice finished edge. You usually have two of them. And then you'll have your two cut edges from where they cut the fabric at the store. So there's a couple things to think about when you're laying out your pattern too. There's a crosswise grain and a lengthwise grain. The lengthwise grain is going to run right with the selvage. And that's important because you like to get that grain nice and straight when you're cutting, because that's what causes your clothes to hang nicely. If you were to maybe turn your pattern slightly and go on the crosswise grain, or you don't quite have it straight, the grain of that fabric isn't straight, and then sometimes your clothes tend to look like they like hang crooked. You could have a really straight hem that like measures correctly, but if it's not cut on the grain, it just looks crooked. It hangs a little weird. And then the bias is the diagonal of a woven fabric, and that actually stretches a lot. So sometimes you might end up cutting a strap or maybe like a yoke of something, and it'll tell you to cut on the bias, and that's because they want it to have a little more stretch than that piece. And your pattern should usually tell you if you're going to be cutting on the lengthwise grain or the bias for your pieces. But I would say like 95% of the time you'll be cutting on the lengthwise grain. So on your pattern piece, there's going to be a line right down the middle of it somewhere, and that's the one that you measure to line up with your selvage. And when you take the time to do that, you really will have nice straight pieces, and when you sew them, they're going to lay nice and straight. Does anybody have any questions about that part? Okay. So here's a better drawing of it too. So you can see where you have your cut edges and your selvage edges, and then your lengthwise grain goes with your selvage. Sometimes you hear that called a warp and a weft. I don't hear that too much anymore. I used to hear that a little bit more when I was sewing with like my grandma. But we usually just talk about like our lengthwise grain is the important one that we pay attention to. And then when you're getting your fabric ready too, when you're folding it and laying it out so you can put your pattern pieces on, it's important to pay attention to the right side of your fabric and the wrong side of your fabric. And in this example, it's really easy to see that the right side of our fabric is the pretty bright blue and white polka dots, and that the wrong side of our fabric is a dull one. Sometimes if you get a fabric that is dyed and not printed, sometimes it's really hard to tell the difference between the right side and the wrong side. So when I do that, I like to put a safety pin on the right side of my fabric for all of my pieces so that I remember that this is the right side of my fabric. So when I am putting pieces together and it tells me two right sides together, I always have my two safety pins going together. Hold on, my battery says it's getting low. All right. Sorry, I put it on the charge. All right, there we go. Here you can see that they have the fabric laid out. So they folded right sides together. So selvage to selvage is how you want to fold it. And then they have a nice crisp fold where they can put some of their pieces that need to be cut on the fold. And you can see on the piece of the back, the up and down, the lengthwise grain that they need, that is lined up with the selvage. So this is how you would want to cut out this dress. And then inside your pattern is also going to be lots of fabulous instructions with great, great visuals. And you can see in your instructions, the dark sides of the pattern are where you see the 1 and the 1. That is the right side of your fabric going together. And then the white side is actually the wrong side of your fabric. So they illustrate when you're putting right sides together to help you know what to do for those. But one thing you want to think about before you start sewing your pieces is really you cut out your fabric, and then you're going to want to finish your edges somehow. Especially if you have a fabric that's going to like fray a little bit. This just helps your garment last a lot longer. And there's a couple different ways you can finish your edges. So you can do it with a zigzag stitch, which is what I usually do at home. It's just a setting on my machine. I just turn it 2 clicks and I go around all of my edges and I sew a zigzag stitch in it. If you have a serger at home, which is the white one, the white stitches, you can always serge your edges. Even just doing an additional straight stitch down near the edge can help it from fraying a little bit. And I know some people sometimes use their pinking shears because the zigzag will help the fabric not fray as much. So my personal favorite, if I just want to stick on my machine, is I like to do a zigzag stitch. All right, so I know I went a little fast. If you guys have any questions at all or anything on what I covered you'd like to know more about?